All right, good morning. Thanks for joining the Prenatal to 3 Policy Forum today. In order to maximize bandwidth and viewing optimization, microphones and cameras are off for all attendees. For any questions, please input them into the Q&A chat panel that you can find on your dashboard down below on your Zoom screen. Questions will be moderated by Jane and the team during the Q&A portions. I do need to disclose that this session is being recorded. Again, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. I will have Jane Kretzman kick us off.
Good morning. On behalf of Elders for Infants and to our whole team of people, a special thanks to the University of St. Thomas for their generous support of the Prenatal to 3 Forum. You've been wonderful co-sponsors. And in addition, I'd like to thank Representative Dave Pinto and to welcome Representative Lisa Damuth to the Forum's bipartisan team of legislators who are co-hosts for the Forum. We aren't going to have time to hear any long remarks from either of our legislators, but I did want to just have a chance to greet Representative Damuth and have her just say hello. So I'm going to stop my video and turn it over to her for just a second.
Good morning. It's good to be with you. I look forward to the continued work and learning more along with you. As a point of note, I am in my second term in the legislature, and I have been serving under Chair Pinto on the Early Childhood Committee, both last term and this term. We're doing great work there, but I was also awarded the NCSL Early Childhood Fellowship, which will also be taking place later today. We're going to be looking at areas of family and child well-being, learning environments, and local and state systems. So I'm looking forward to additional knowledge that I can bring back to you with what I've gained in the fall. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Damuth. Our plan is that they will hopefully be able to, both Representative Pinto and Representative Damuth will be able to join us during the Q&A portion of the agenda later. But for sure, you will be seeing them on October 20th, when we actually have an in-person fall forum scheduled. And so we're just thrilled. Just to reiterate what Hayani Yang mentioned earlier, you may submit your questions anytime during the program, and please use the Q&A function, we'll be monitoring those questions. So with that, I want to welcome our first group of presenters who are no strangers to our podium and who represent a range of early childhood advocacy at the Capitol. The order among this first group will be Deb Fitzpatrick, Laura LaCroix DeLune, and Claire Sanford. So Deb, we'll have you go ahead and start us off. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Representative Pinto, Representative Damuth. Very happy to be here today to start off some updates. Next slide, please. And I'm going to concentrate my remarks this morning on some elements related to economic stability for children and families. We know that even small increases in family income, especially during these earliest childhood years, really do have a significant impact on the lifetime trajectory of our children. It can improve academic, health, and economic outcomes according to the National Academy of Sciences. And we also know that over half of Minnesota households with children lost income since March 2020 due to the pandemic, and those rates were even higher for our Black, Brown, and Indigenous households. But it's really important to acknowledge, right, that even before COVID, too many of our Minnesota children were subject to the instability of low-wage work and deep poverty. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk today about some of the federal flexible cash assistance efforts for children and families that have occurred over the last year. And I wanted to say that in over 40 listening sessions that CDF did around the state as part of the PDG planning process for the state, we heard consistently about the need for flexible cash to cover a variety of expenses that come up in the lives of families. And during the pandemic, some of those sources of mostly unrestricted cash support during the pandemic included stimulus checks, unemployment insurance, the child tax credit, and MFIP one-time payments. So next slide, please. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about unemployment insurance, because I think we don't often think of this as a program that supports children. But we know from the Census Bureau's Pulse survey that at least 341,000 Minnesotans with children benefited from our unemployment insurance system in 2020, and another 114,000 in 2021. So I think one of the things that the pandemic has really highlighted is how our unemployment insurance system works and doesn't work. And in Minnesota, that program generally only replaces around 50% of wages. And that's why the federal government stepped up with the top-ups, first the $600, then the $400. And then also that there's a number of people, workers in our economy that aren't covered by unemployment insurance under normal circumstances. And those include contractors and self-employed workers. And, the addition of support for those workers was an important federal element as well. And all of these, pieces were really important to support children during the pandemic. But we know that unemployment occurs, regardless of pandemics, and that, historically, not everyone has been able to get equitable access to that program. So just wanted to highlight that federal efforts are underway to reform the unemployment insurance system based on these innovations and other learnings from the pandemic. So I think that will be something we, as child advocates, should be paying attention to, again, knowing that this is an important support for families to make sure that income remains, that income is there for families regardless of what's going on with a parent's employment situation. Next slide, please. So probably all of you have heard something about the child tax credit. It's all over the news this week because it is going to be starting tomorrow, actually. The monthly payments are going to be starting to go out the door to families throughout the state. You've probably heard that this is going to be a kind of revolutionary poverty cutting policy in Minnesota and across the country. It's expected to drop Minnesota's child poverty rate by 48%. And importantly for our, racial disparities, which are among the worst in the country, it's expected to drop our the poverty rate for Black children in the state by 55%. I think one of the things that, again, the pandemic has highlighted is how the prior policies related to the child tax credit actually disadvantaged some of our most lowest income families. So prior to and this should say the American Rescue Plan, sorry, there's an error on this slide. Prior to the American Rescue Plan expansions, around 322,000 Minnesota children didn't qualify for the full credit because their parents lacked earnings or had earnings that were too low. So I think it's important to acknowledge that this change that's occurring and taking place starting tomorrow is going to make sure that those children are eligible for the same levels of investment as other children. And most significant, I think for this group, it's important to note that the expansion of the dollar amount of the tax credit moving from $2,000 to $3,600 is a larger increase for children under 5, recognizing the significant costs that families incur in those earliest years. And then again, for Minnesota, I think analyses show that, again, due to the way that the tax credit has priorly been associated with income, half of children in rural areas couldn't benefit from the full credit prior to ARP. So those are all important elements that I think we want to be looking at as we go forward. Next slide, please. I wanted to just note that even though these credits are starting to kind of roll out the door starting tomorrow, that the Treasury Department, the Federal Treasury Department estimates that as many as 33,000 Minnesota children under 18 may be eligible, but are unclaimed for those CTC credits. So we're really trying to get the word out that those folks that haven't filed for taxes in the past are eligible, their children are eligible. So anything anyone can do in this network to get the word out, we really want to make sure. Also that even though these payments are starting to go out the door tomorrow, they are based on prior tax information for those that are automatically getting money. And there are ways that you can go in and adjust the number of children. So if you've had a child, for example, since 2020, you are eligible based on your current status. And so it's important to go in and make those changes. Then finally, just wanted to point out that these CTC payments are not counted against other forms of support for our families. And that isn't always the case. And that's something CDF has really kept an eagle eye on, is how these different supports interact with each other. And sometimes when we give one, we take away another. And I think we need to be looking at that. And it's really important that CTC doesn't do that. So next slide, please. And then finally wanted to talk about the Minnesota Family Investment Program. This is primarily a children's program, 64,000 children, up from 59,000 before the pandemic. Recipients on this program are children, almost half under 6, and a significant portion of those are living in deep poverty. And while needs grew, a significant pool of federal funds were sitting untapped. So we're very excited that the legislature moved ahead with getting most of those funds allocated and out the door during this last legislative session. The federal ARP included TANF funding for one-time COVID relief recovery payments, and the legislature approved those at $435 per family. So it'll be great that those funds are going out the door for those families. And then I think one of the most exciting things for many of us that have been fighting for decades, that we now will have a cost of living increase for the cash assistance portion of that program, using TANF funds during the next couple bienniums and possibly some state funds after that. But very excited to see that program now keeping up with inflation, since it took a couple decades to get the last cash increase in place a couple years ago. So next slide, please. Finally, wanted to talk about, we have been fighting for paid family medical leave in the state of Minnesota for a number of years. That also is happening. There's also a lot of conversation about that at the federal level. That did not precede this legislative session. I did want to lift up another effort, a bipartisan effort that was successful, and that is an expansion of our pregnancy and nursing accommodations. Those now apply to additional workers and additional employers, and wanted to make sure that people were aware of a new parents page at the Department of Labor and Industry. This is an important source of information for new parents to understand their rights. And then also lift up some Know Your Rights materials that the Wilder African American Babies Coalition has put together to help parents understand what their rights are related to those pregnancy and nursing accommodations. Next slide, please. So again, probably anybody watching the news understands that there are really big decisions being made at the federal level right now about investments in infrastructure and what the next budget will look like. And I think we do have a once in a generation opportunity in front of us right now to make transformative investments in children at the federal level. And as Claire and Laura will mention in their comments, many of the advances we were able to make during the legislative session really were possible due to federal resources. So I think it's really an important time for everyone to consider sharing their input with our federal delegation. I've listed a couple of opportunities here, but one on the CTC, making that permanent, making those expansions we discussed earlier permanent. That expansion only is going through for a year now. And then some other opportunities related to childcare. And I think Claire was going to be up next, and we'll talk about some of those opportunities. But I think one of the things that we really also want to make sure is that our federal delegation is understanding what we've learned here in the state of Minnesota during the pandemic about ways to invest in our children. And so I would just really encourage everyone involved in this community to think about reaching out to your members of Congress and sharing the importance of investing in children in some way or another, again, depending on your experience and your lens. So I'll stop there, and I'm going to turn it, I believe, over to Claire next to talk some about childcare.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Rep. Pinto, as usual, for this opportunity, and welcome, Representative Dameth. Very exciting to have you part of these forums now, and it's been very exciting to work with you since you entered the legislature. And thank you, Deb, for that wonderful overview of all of the economic stability advances over the last year, which are really incredible. And as Deb said, we would really like to keep as much as possible going forward, because we all know that the economic stability of families is the underpinning of everything, and childcare advances and health advances and all the other advances we can talk about all rest on that. So for my portion today, I'm going to do a broad overview of what the early care and education or the childcare field got in general out of the Minnesota budget deal in the endless session that finally ended. Oh, thank you so much, Hayana. It feels like I can't imagine what it's like to be a legislator who was in this session, because it feels beyond, and it felt beyond endless for any of us in the legislative orbit. The biggest takeaway is that Minnesota got a lot done for childcare that will be operationalized over the next 2 to 4 years. There are major advances to celebrate, which we'll talk about. And I went back, this has never happened in my career. I actually went back to the presentation that I used for our April Prenatal to 3 forum and went through the things that I had talked about there that were in the mix for discussion at the legislature. And I went, wowzers, almost all of it actually happened. I mean, we never get to say this is incredible. The big takeaway is that other than approximately 8 million of state funds that were used in our jobs and economic development committees, this is all due to federal money, mostly from ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act. So just want to hit Deb's point on the importance of federal involvement and federal advocacy. Our state actually invested almost zero of its own money in childcare in this budget. Now, one might say that's because childcare got a lot of federal money in the recovery packages, which is true, but education and healthcare and other sectors got a lot of federal money in those packages too, but no one says they're not worthy of additional state investment. So we need to keep the drumbeat up for state investment as well. But it's exciting, and thank goodness for all the federal work we did over the last year, because these resources came to Minnesota and we were able to do a lot of the things we're about to talk about. Next slide, please. I'll start by talking about advances in the Child Care Assistance Program, or CCAP. This is always a big ticket item. It is a very expensive item. And we are so excited to announce that we were able to move the percentile of provider payment rates up from the 25th percentile of 2018 market rates to, starting this January, the 40th percentile of 2021 market rates for infants and toddlers. That's a huge advance for infants and toddlers and their families. And we will move up to the 30th percentile for preschool and school age kids. And part of this deal not only includes this update in the rates for infants and toddlers to the 40th percentile, which of course will help providers who serve infants and toddlers, but also families, because families have more buying power and more choice when these rates go up. So this is good across the board. And we know that to be in federal compliance, we have to update our CCAP rates to the most recent market rates survey, and it can't be more than 3 years old. And Minnesota does a market rate survey every 3 years. And we were hoping to get language in this agreement that would say every 3 years, rates are automatically adjusted to that most recent market rate survey. We did not get that far, but we got, I think, what is a great compromise, which is that rates will update this January to the 2021 market rate survey. And then the law also says that there will be a second update to the 2024 market rate survey in January of 2025. So there are 2 updates that will happen. So that gives some certainty to providers and families, which is wonderful. And we also got another really good compromise, I think, a 3-year reprioritization of the basic sliding fee wait list for CCAP. And I believe we've talked about this at past forums, and I won't go into the details because it's complicated and not that interesting, except that it means when we prioritize the wait list for families eligible for basic sliding fee CCAP, so these are families who are not getting CCAP through MFIP, we're going to be able to serve more children and families over the next 3 years by reprioritizing the priority groups on the wait list, and it will not harm anyone. No one is going to lose childcare assistance that was already getting it. We're just going to be able to get some new families into the system, which is really great. This agreement also involves, speaking of the wait list, an investment for 4 years, I believe, in that wait list. So hopefully the wait list will shrink with the reprioritization because we're able to serve more families, but we're also putting additional funds into that wait list, so which will hopefully keep those wait lists even lower or even eliminate them in some counties, which is also very exciting to get families into the workforce and children into high quality environments. We're also doing an increase in rates to legal non-licensed providers who currently get the 68th percentile, or 68% rather, of family child care rates. That's being moved up to 90% of family child care rates to help families using that legal non-licensed, sometimes called family friend and neighbor care option. And all of this is funded through the Child Care and Development Block Grant, federal money. Next slide, please. We have a lot of workforce advances to celebrate in this budget. So, and it's great because for years we've been talking about the workforce, but it hasn't gotten attention. But over the work of several people, many people over the last few years, it has come to the forefront as really the underpinning of this whole early childhood education system. So in this budget, the TEACH program, which gives scholarships to early childhood professionals to further their education and get college degrees, gets some additional funding. The RETAIN program, which is a retention bonus grant that goes to professionals in the field to keep them in childcare and not leave for higher wage jobs in other fields, that got additional funding. Childcare workforce development grants were created and funded. I honestly don't know much about what those are going to be yet, but I like the title and it's got money and that's exciting. There's funding put in for background study fees, which often fall on providers or individual staff members to pay for. Obviously, and those background studies are necessary to work with children. Increased CCAP rates I already talked about, but I wanted to add that as a huge workforce advance because that gives providers more resources to pay themselves and pay their staff. Stabilization grants I'll talk about in a minute, and I believe Stephanie will talk more about later. $212 million worth of those stabilization grants are going to increase compensation over the next couple of years for childcare providers across the state. That's like a $212 million raise for our childcare provider workforce over the next couple of years. And also the Great Start for All Minnesota Children Task Force, another great bipartisan compromise, was funded. And this doesn't just look at workforce, it looks at affordability and quality for families, access for families, how are we going to get to a system that works in Minnesota? But a huge important piece of that, and I actually quoted it, is that this task force is also charged with ensuring that Minnesota's early childhood educators are qualified, diverse, supported, and equitably compensated, regardless of setting. So that is a big deal. Next slide, please. Family child care, and thank you to Rep. Damath for your service on the Family Child Care Task Force. Family child care was positioned very well for when the federal resources came, and a lot was advanced in this sector, which is fantastic. And family child care, of course, is especially important to this group because it's often the most affordable infant and toddler care and the most accessible throughout greater Minnesota. So The Family Child Care Task Force spanned parts of 3 different calendar years and was bipartisan and very intensive work to get to a series of recommendations. And it's really exciting to see that a lot of those recommendations are actually moving forward with this federal funding. It's like the recommendations were ready just as the federal funding came in, and it was one of those wonderful times where things can actually just be implemented. So I'll run through these quickly. Family Child Care is going to be getting an ombudsperson in Minnesota, additional orientation training for providers, a training advisory group for the training that family child care providers receive ongoing, many more specific Family Child Care Task Force recommendations are going to be implemented, a work group to identify innovative models of providing family child care that are not currently allowed in licensing is going to start up. There's going to be a shared services pilot for those sort of back-end services like accounting or other things that maybe family child care providers could share among themselves to help their businesses run. And there's going to be a major licensing modernization project and a move towards updating childcare regulations, matching them to best practice, making them make more sense for providers and children, and moving towards a risk-based licensing system. And the exciting thing is that this is not only for family child care, but has also been funded for child care centers too. So the entire regulatory system for licensed child care will be going through a modernization process. Next slide, please. Other good stuff, because I couldn't figure out a title to put it all under, because there's so much good stuff that happened in this budget. We got a parent aware validation study, funding of a study to look at how many children in foster care in Minnesota are actively participating in the early childhood programs for which they're eligible. And if not enough of them are, we'll have that data and we can look at how to get more of them into these early childhood programs for which they're eligible. There's going to be a new early childhood governance report, which might be a step towards creating a new department of early childhood in Minnesota, which is an exciting thing to look at. There are 6 states so far that have done this. So Minnesota still has the opportunity to be an early adopter, as I like to say, of that type of movement. There's a pilot project that will be between counties and childcare providers, specifically to look at better ways to serve children with significant disabilities in community childcare. There are facility revitalization grants. These are not startup or major construction grants, but for existing providers to do minor renovation, to come into licensing compliance, or to make their spaces more developmentally appropriate. Provider business training. And then the grants, I highlighted them in yellow because these last 2 grants are the ones that are funded with state money. And they didn't go through the Health and Human Services or Education Committee, but through our workforce jobs committees. So there will be additional grants for childcare through DEED with a 50% focus on Greater Minnesota, and then additional grants to our initiative foundations, which do amazing work in the childcare space, and 100% of their focus is on Greater Minnesota. Next slide, please. This is what we got for early learning scholarships in this session. No, this slide is not a mistake. We got a big 0 in this area. This is kind of the one big area where we went, oh, missed opportunity. We're celebrating all of the other things, but somehow with all of this money and agreement among a huge swath of advocates and legislators that both CCAP and early learning scholarship funding additions were needed. And even though, everyone claims to love scholarships, we got 0 here in terms of new investment. We did not even get any of the policy changes that were being discussed. Most important to this group would be opening full eligibility to scholarships for infants and toddlers. So this is a disappointment and a more to come area this session, but there is still hope that the remaining flexible ARPA funds, which half are left over for the legislature to discuss in the upcoming session, could go towards early learning scholarships over the next year. So we will certainly be keeping an eye on that. And finally, next slide, please. Stephanie, I believe, will go into more of this, but the other huge bucket of federal money coming was in a new program called Provider Stabilization Grants. And these funds are mandated by federal law to go to direct grants to providers. They're open to, and this is a mistake, I said licensed providers, both family, childcare, and centers. They're also open to certified providers and some other groups. So I want to make sure I correct that. 70% of these funds are mandated to go to increased compensation. And that was put in by the Minnesota legislature to recognize the need for increased compensation and recognition of our frontline childcare providers and the work they have done. So that is very exciting. There will be both base grants based on financial need and tiered grants. Somehow, this is all still being figured out based on individual provider service of families using CCAP or scholarships, so low-income families. Grants will decrease in amount after the first year of payments to kind of wean providers off these temporary funds. And this is the biggest bucket of our ARPA child care funds at 305 total million going into these stabilization grants. So very exciting, and continues the precedence for direct subsidization of providers, which is something we would also like to see continued. So I apologize. I think I went a little over my time, but I will stop there. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Laura LaCroix DeLone, and I'm here today representing both the Prenatal to 3 Coalition and the Minnesota Coalition for Targeted Home Visiting. Next slide. I too want to thank you, Rep. Pinto and Demuth, for hosting this important conversation today, along with the elders and the University of St. Thomas. Next slide. I have the opportunity today to share with you some of the maternal and child health highlights from session. I want to recognize the fact that even though I'm representing a couple of the coalitions, a lot of this work was done by many partners who aren't with you today to share in these successes. And I want to recognize no one did this alone. Many of the policy priorities that we focused on during session really were attempting to address policy needs where we found some additional flexibilities during the public health emergency, whether they were federal policies or state policies. And the goal was to make many of them permanent moving forward. So, and then in addition to that, I also want to highlight that many of the policy goals you'll see highlighted here are really paying attention to the health inequities, maternal and infant health inequities that we see in Minnesota, particularly in our Black, African-American community and Indigenous communities across the state of Minnesota. So next slide. Let me highlight a few of the successes and the wins. We are excited to report that the medical assistance coverage, postpartum coverage, was extended by 12 months. You may recall we currently, in current statute, we have a 60-day coverage. During the public health emergency, no one has been allowed to be cut off of medical assistance. So everyone has been covered continuously during this, during the public health emergency. And the benefits to maintaining coverage beyond the 60 days help increase stability for moms after birth, both health and mental health benefits to this extension. So this has been a big, important win. This extension will begin July 1 of 2022. Currently, the public health emergency is in place at the federal level. There's a verbal agreement that it will go through the end of 2021. We have a 3-month extension beyond that. So March of 2022 is when the federal emergency might end and we might have a gap in coverage. So this extension for Minnesota will begin July 2022. So we will continue as advocates to try to fill that gap in the upcoming sessions. I'm also excited to share the work, and many of you may have seen or heard some of the news reports on the Dignity of Childcare Birth Act. This act really provides funding for a new curriculum for labor and delivery staff and training to help address implicit bias that is experienced by our Black and Indigenous women and families during pregnancy and childbirth process. So this will, the curriculum will be coming through the University of Minnesota, and then training will be available statewide. I'm also excited to share that there's an update to our newborn screening. And we now are going to be screening for the human herpesvirus 5 or HH5 or CMV. So for all of my healthcare friends out there, this is a new screening that will be added in the new beginning in July. So, it is July, sorry. Session went so long, I almost forgot. Beginning July of this year. So we'll begin screening for that. Next slide. Another policy initiative that is focused on addressing the inequities for Black and Indigenous women in Minnesota is the Integrated Care for High-Risk Pregnancies. This is a program that is funded through the Department of Human Services, and it's really looking at what are some of like the basic structures and care that we can give to women while they are pregnant to address some of the social determinants of health in addition to health care. So this was expanded. So there will be additional funding to move beyond the current pilots in the state of Minnesota. And we are very excited to build upon the expertise and the learning from the initial pilots. The Healthy Start Act is another piece that passed in legislation. I believe we talked about this earlier, but think it's really important to highlight. The Healthy Start Act focuses on women who are in state prison, so it's a smaller population. This does not impact county jails. But if you are pregnant or parenting up to the first 12 months, the Department of Corrections will now have the opportunity to move the pregnant individual and the young family into community alternatives settings where they can begin to build that important bond with their child in the first year of life while serving time. So it will count as time and it helps with the bonding. This has been important because currently in law, if you give birth, you have 48 hours with your child and then the child is removed. And we know how important those first few years of life are, and this will help with some of the brain development and attachment that is critical. And again, just restating that about 86 to 87% of all parents, both moms and dads who are incarcerated, end up going back to parenting their children. So this is an important step forward. Some new funding that came forward is supporting healthy development of babies. It is one-time funding for the biennium, 2 years, to the African American Babies Coalition and projects at Wilder. And this is really focused on supporting community-driven training and education and capacity building to really help out our Black and Indigenous families. So we are excited to see this, this one-time funding as well. Next slide. And then for those of you who have been following the home visiting, I have come to you for a number of years talking about this desire to have increased flexibility in our state funding to allow both evidence-based and evidence-informed or promising practice programs funded. I am very excited to say that this policy passed. It's actually one of the pieces of policy that passed during the actual session as part of the skinny HHS bill. And I really do want to shout out Rep. Pinto for really pushing to include this policy change in the skinny bill. So we are very excited about that. And in addition, the legislature allocated an additional $4.5 million over the next 4 years. So in a 3-year period, there'll be an additional $1.5 million. These funds will be really targeted towards some of these evidence-informed or promising practice programs. And I know the Home Visiting Coalition is working closely with the health department to get listening sessions planned for how these funds might be used and what are the programs that we want to see funded. So implementation is already beginning. I will also highlight 2 other quick pieces on home visiting. There was initially, the administration in their initial budget had recommended a cut to one of the home visiting programs called Nurse Family Partnership. That cut did not happen, and the legislature decided to fully fund it instead. And then finally, I want to recognize that there was federal funds. The federal funding for home visiting is called MICV. And we thought we would see about a $3.4 million increase in federal funds. The federal funding actually came through much lower for Minnesota at about $800,000 for the first year. Those funds will be focused on incentives for families and helping address some of the ongoing needs around food insecurity, so they will be able to help families with food cards, etc. Let's see, the substance abuse reporting changes is another important maternal policy that has passed. This will allow healthcare providers, social workers, home visitors working with families for somebody who is pregnant and actively seeking care for substance abuse. They are not required, they will no longer be required to report it. If somebody stops the care, the substance abuse care or their prenatal care, then you will be required to report it. But this is an effort to ensure as many women as possible receive prenatal care, whether they're using or not, so that we can get the best outcomes for both mom and baby and help in recovery. And also helps decriminalize substance abuse during pregnancy. And then I want to highlight there is additional funding for Head Start, and this was all federal funding. Our programs here in Minnesota need to apply with the federal government. Next slide. I just have a couple more things I want to highlight here. I know Claire mentioned the legally non-licensed funding increase, but there is also an allocation for a family friend and neighbor care program through the Department of Human Services. This is something that we saw back in the early 90s or mid 90s, excuse me. So this is going forward with some one-time funding. The Department of Human Services has also identified federal funds to help support family friend and neighbor care. We know many of our infants in Minnesota and toddlers are cared for by family and friends, and we really want to make sure they have the training, opportunities, and access to educational materials and safety materials for their own homes. Next slide. Two other really important things that impact maternal and child health, and I want to just quickly highlight, I know that we need to move on, the telehealth bill. We are moving forward in Minnesota with by extending the telehealth bill beyond the public health emergency, so you can access health and mental health services and still get paid as a full visit. And then and we'll come back in 2023 to revisit this. And then I'm very excited about the BIPOC mental health workforce efforts that got passed, or initiatives that got passed. So this is really a bill that's aimed at increasing the number of, increasing the diversity in our mental health providers, including loan forgiveness and training opportunities. So I will finish off there and happy to respond to questions.
Thank you, Laura. I think we're going to, and I want to just thank our whole team for their work. We're running, of course, our usual a little bit behind. So Stephanie Hoganson is our next speaker from the Children's Cabinet. She's got 25 minutes, and we will be pushing forward. And I just want to again thank the team of people for synthesizing and summarizing a very huge amount of information. So thanks, and I turn you now to Stephanie. So Stephanie.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I will try to breeze through a little bit quicker since we're behind, but I just wanted to do a quick overview of what I hope to talk about. I have Deb Swenson-Klatt from DHS Child Development Services and Cindy Yang, the Director of DHS Child Care Services Division, with me to talk about Child Care Stabilization Grant implementation. Claire gave an overview of some of what passed during the legislative session. and the federal funds available for that. And then a quick overview of the Great Start for All Minnesota Children Task Force, because the administration and staffing for that task force, where the Children's Cabinet, of course, is housed. And then a quick summary of our early childhood governance and finance app, and some PDG updates. So with that, if you could go to the next slide, and I'll turn it over to Deb Swenson-Klatt, who's going to talk about the Child Care Stabilization Grant implementation.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. Thanks to Stephanie and the Children's Cabinet for the ongoing partnership on planning for and implementing this program, and for the partnership and leadership of the legislature in helping shape this program. As Claire mentioned, the Child Care Stabilization Grant Program is a historic investment in childcare that builds on two programs that DHS with the Children's Cabinet and the legislature, with respect to the first one here listed here, implemented since the start of the COVID pandemic. And so just wanted to call out that we have been supporting Minnesota's incredible childcare provider industry since April of 2020 through the peacetime emergency child care grants, with $40 million invested to support these programs providing care to essential workers. And then beginning in July 2020 through last month, May 21, we have provided nearly $20 million in the Child Care Public Health Support Funds program, again, trying to ensure that Minnesota's providers can remain operating and open to serve Minnesota's families. Next slide, please. The Child Care Stabilization Grants are shaped both by federal and now state law, and we're beginning the implementation of them in Minnesota right now with transition payments that will lead us from the Public Health Support Funds program into a fully implemented stabilization grant program. There are transition payments available in June and July for Minnesota's childcare providers. The June application closes today at 4 p.m. and all eligible providers that were open and operating during June are invited to apply and answer questions added to the June application regarding staffing and finances. And in addition to indicating interest in receiving the June payments, the data collected from the questions regarding staffing and finances in this June application will help us to structure the grant payments that we will start rolling out in September. Listed here are the monthly funding amounts for the June and July transition payments: $600 for licensed family childcare programs, $4,250 for licensed centers with a smaller capacity, $5,500 for licensed centers with a capacity of more than 75 children, and then $1,500 per month for certified centers. Next slide, please. Following the law passed in session, the full implementation of the Child Care Stabilization Grants will proceed following these transition month payments for June and July. And in September, beginning in September, we'll begin to implement a program that has both base grants, as Claire mentioned, and grants for financial hardship. There are some details here that I'll just briefly touch on, and happy to provide more information in the Q&A. Some of those details include the provision that grants are intended to be scaled downward in terms of the grant amounts. So between July 1st, 2022 and June 30th, 23, the amounts will be reduced such that the final month of grant awards will be no more than 50% of the amounts awarded September 21. Also importantly, and as Claire noted, there is a requirement for providers receiving base grant awards that 70% of the awards must be used to provide increased compensation, benefits, or premium pay to all paid employees, sole proprietors, or independent contractors regularly caring for children. In addition to the base grants, additional grant amounts will be provided to eligible programs facing extreme financial hardship until all of the money set aside for that purpose is awarded. So again, we have a program that will be beginning in September to provide base grants and then need-based grant amounts. These funding amounts are not yet determined. We'll be using the information from the June applications to help us structure the amounts. To Claire's mention of the amount of the total funds available and estimated to support that increased compensation provision, we will share an update with those who are interested as soon as we have information about that dollar amount. And then finally, and importantly, another part of the base grant amount provision is that to be determined by Department of Human Services will be providing an enhanced base grant amount for providers who receive child care assistance and/or early learning scholarship payments, supporting giving them an extra boost in the important work they do to serve vulnerable children. Next slide, please. Here is a listing of the eligible child care programs for the Child Care Stabilization Grant Program, including a number of programs that have received support through the previous programs we've implemented. But also importantly, there is the inclusion of legal non-licensed childcare providers. These are family friend and neighbor caregivers who are registered to serve children receiving CCAP. And so they are a newly eligible group to these financial support programs. There are approximately 180 of these programs currently in Minnesota. Next slide, please. Here's a bit of information about eligibility for programs. Programs, as with the peacetime emergency grants and the public health support funds, must not be subject of a fraud finding or prohibited from receiving federal funds or have a license or certification under revocation, temporary immediate suspension, or decertification. And in addition, following federal law, each applicant for a grant period must attest to these two provisions, that they must comply with federal requirements around maintaining compensation levels for employees, as well as complying with health and safety guidance related to COVID, and to the extent practicable, provide tuition and co-payment relief to enrolled families. And programs must remain open and must remain operating and serving children for the duration of the grant period. There are exceptions, however, related to public health guidance implementation. Next slide, please. Finally, here is a listing of the Stabilization Grant Fund eligible uses or allowable uses of the funds. I won't read through them all. They are available in any information in describing this program in federal law and in state law as well. But just to note, the first one, personnel costs, is of course important, and Minnesota is implementing its own particular requirement that 70% of the base grants be used for increased compensation. But for the remaining amount of grant funds that any provider receives, this is a listing of all of the other allowable uses. So with that, Stephanie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. I am gonna kind of breeze through my next slides, and hopefully in our next conversation or the Q&A, we can get any more detail that people are interested in. I'm going to talk about the Great Start for All Minnesota Children Task Force, just really quickly provide an overview. You can go to the next slide. The task force, as Claire mentioned, was passed during the legislative session, and many advocates, including MC Claire and her organization, CDF and others, advocated for this task force to ensure plan and implementation timeline to meet these 3 goals. Goals related to costs and affordability, access to high quality care, and that Minnesota compensated. And the legislation itself, some of the strategies to achieve these goals that will be required within the plan. Next slide. The task force, or the legislation, outlines task force membership. And so one of the reasons I wanted to share a little bit of information today is because the membership, much of the membership is appointed by the governor. So they will be posted on the Secretary of State website. And there'll be 15 voting members, 2 members of the House and 2 members of the Senate appointed by each body's leadership. The governor appointed membership includes 2 parents of children under age 5, 2 family child care license holders, 2 center directors, 3 early childhood educators, a tribal representative, and and a children's cabinet representative. And then there's 22 non-voting members from the agencies listed below that are commissioner appointments. There's several organization appointments named in statute, and then an early childhood education faculty member and a nationally recognized expert in early care and education financing will also be appointed by the governor as non-voting members. And as I mentioned previously, task force staffing and administration in statute was prescribed to Minnesota Management and Budget, or MMB. And so, and of course, the Children's Cabinet is housed in MMB. So on the next slide, the timeline for the task force, we are actually hoping to have appointments posted by the end of August, if not earlier in the month of August. So keep a lookout for those. By November, we hope to have the governor appointments made. And then the legislation requires December 1st to be the date by which the first task force meeting is held. And then just over 1 year later, on December 15, 2022, is the first deadline for the task force to submit preliminary findings and draft implementation plans. And then final recommendation and implementation plans must be submitted to the governor and the legislature on February 1st, 2023. So we look forward to bringing that group together to develop the plans and meet the prescribed duties under the legislation. On the next slide, I just wanted to quickly share with folks, you can go to the next slide actually, that are not aware, we did do some engagement around this grant application, but the new venture fund had a grant application for states, territories, and tribal nations around early childhood governance and finance that Minnesota actually submitted a letter of interest a few months ago and were invited to apply for the full grant. I think we were one of 8 states or territories that were invited to apply for 3-year grant awards up to $1 million. And the purpose of these grants are to enhance the governing and or financing structure of early childhood systems, with a particular focus on addressing historic marginalization and exclusion of BIPOC children and families and lower income families. And we decided to focus on kind of the financing of our early childhood system in this grant application. So on the next slide, we kind of list what we're hoping to do with this grant, and that's to analyze state investments using a newly developed children's fiscal map, evaluate the influx of federal resources through the ARP and otherwise, and develop plans for sustaining those benefits. And then also work to develop a plan to advance the recommendations of the Transforming the Financing of the Early Care and Education Committee that we know have done such a good job already developing recommendations in that area. And then on the last slide here, just noting that the timeline, we just submitted our proposal, our full proposal last week. And in late August, we'll find out if we received the grant, and then we'll start executing the grant in September 2021. And just grateful to those organizations and individuals who helped review our proposal and provide input. And last, I just want to give a brief update on preschool development grant activities. As a quick recap, the preschool development grant is a cross-agency effort between DHS, MDE, MDH, and the Children's Cabinet to align early childhood education and care systems across the state. Of course, the planning phase was implemented in 2019, and we are fully in the implementation phase of the grant that will end December 31st, 2022. Many of you know that Help Me Connect launched in May 2021, and the tool is in a testing phase, and a referral mechanism is being built, and it's an online service and resource navigator tool that's been in development for a while. The 12 community resource hubs that are funded by the preschool development grant are key to testing the service before kind of full launch in the coming months. And then we've been engaging with implementing trauma and healing responsive infant and early childhood learning communities. And those have been launched in 10 communities statewide. And they're going to use the infant and early childhood mental health consultation model. And we're also continuing to expand a trauma-informed toolkit and several other trainings for those who work with children and families on early childhood mental health and trauma and healing response. And then we're also making progress on implementing some use cases and the work planned in the grant for improving coordination and eligibility of services for children and families. We're kind of working through a lot of the legal elements and laying the groundwork for an expanded common application for many of the programs that young children and families access, as well as data linkages to reduce burden on families in applying for all the programs that they may be eligible for. One of the uses of the legal work that we have been doing and kind of coordinating services, particularly across the 3 agencies involved in the preschool development grant, Education, Health, and Human Services, was that the legal work we did laid the foundation for kind of an easier implementation of the pandemic EBT or food benefit program, which some may know was recently expanded to include young children 0 to 5 who are in families accessing SNAP. So we look forward to leveraging some of that legal work that we've done to improve coordination of services for families that are in some programs to make better and more streamlined connections to other services and supports. The state is also beginning to work on some more culturally specific resources to support children, families, schools, and communities around transitions to kindergarten. And then last, we've launched a new video on the importance of the early childhood system in Minnesota, and it's just under 5 minutes. I won't play it this morning, but if you'd like to see it, it's on the Preschool Development Grant website under Working Together to Improve Early Childhood Systems. And the PDG also recently launched a newsletter, so you can subscribe to that to get kind of the latest updates on the preschool development grant activities. And with that concludes my updates and look forward to the Q&A, and always happy to answer questions if you reach out after the forum as well.
Thank you, Stephanie. That's wonderful. And again, an immense amount of work and information condensed here to you and to Deb. And now I want to introduce someone who's rather new to our forum. And I'm just going to catch a spelling thing that I noticed. It's Lundy, L-U-N-D-E. Landy, rather. I'm sorry, with no U. I mixed up myself. Jennifer Hall Landy is a researcher and a psychologist at the University of Minnesota in the Institute of Community Integration. And she serves now as the CDC ACT Early Ambassador to Minnesota. Her work has focused on promoting healthy development and early identification of developmental delays in children. Today, she's going to share with us some research that she's leading on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on early childhood systems in Minnesota. She also has just 5 minutes, and then we'll turn to the Q&A for the last 15. So take it away, Jen.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Jane, for that nice introduction. It is so nice to be with all of you today. And as Jane said, I have just 5 minutes, so I will be brief in what I present. But yes, I'm Jennifer Hall Landy. I work at the University of Minnesota. I lead the Minnesota ACT Early project. Next slide, please. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention our funders. We work under the national program CDC's Learn the Signs Act Early. I won't go into it, but I encourage all of you to go to the website and take a look at the wealth of free resources we have for parents and childcare providers. Just take a look, and you can certainly order whatever you want. It's a wonderful resource for families. Next slide. So just to give you a little overview, with the Minnesota ACT Early project, this past year, we have had a small grant to look closely at COVID-19 pandemic, how it's affected families, and promoting resilience in Minnesota families. And today, I'm just going to give you a very high-level, brief overview of some of our early findings. Next slide, please. So our goal on the Minnesota ACT Early team, we gather a group of early childhood stakeholders from a variety of agencies and organizations, childcare, all these different lenses, and we work together to understand the impact of COVID on different systems on families and young children birth to 5. We talk, we collect data, and today I'm going to share some of those findings. What we think is really of value are these interdisciplinary perspectives on how we can support families. Next slide. So here's a graphic. I think we all know it is not new information. All of us play a valuable role in supporting families. Often our work is siloed, or we work in parallel, working on many of the same shared goals, but we rarely get a chance to really get together and meet and talk about how our systems intersect and how we can better meet the needs of families. COVID, while it's offered many challenges, it's also offered opportunities in that, can we get together, talk about this challenge in the lives of families, and talk about how we can share resources and discuss common goals. All of us together can work together to find common success stories, common strategies, ways to use our resources more effectively and efficiently. Next slide, please. I created this slide with no help of a graphic designer, as you can see. This is just a cross-section of many of our stakeholders that meet together and share. We all come together as the Minnesota ACT Early project, but we have many, many different stakeholders across the variety of state agencies, organizations that serve children and families, cultural communities, childcare, all of us working together to talk about what we're seeing as a result of the pandemic and how we can work together with strategies and potentially policy to serve children and families better. Next slide. So we asked the question, what is the impact on Minnesota early childhood systems? What has been that impact? Next slide. And today, as I said, I'm going to give you the very high-level overview. We have a report, which I will share, but I'm going to give you the very broad brush. The report has detailed data as well as figures and graphs, but here were some of the trends that we saw. And I think it won't be a surprise really to any of us. One, there was a lot of decrease in engagement across systems. What we were seeing reports of decrease in well child visits, decrease in childhood immunizations, decrease in early childhood referrals, and decrease in developmental screening. We see how our systems are so interconnected. I work in early screening and early identification of developmental delays, and certainly a gateway to that is through well child visits, referrals from pediatricians to early screening. And we see how interconnected this system is. When one breaks down, we see it hit the early childhood system on many different levels. So next slide, please. Some additional data, and you can see it in our report. We saw that Help Me Grow referrals were down approximately 30 to 35% during the pandemic. Early childhood screenings down about 25%. These are approximations. We're still collecting data. Part C, serving children birth to 3, 20% drop in enrollment during the pandemic. So we're seeing significant systems impact during the pandemic. Next slide, please. We also learned during the pandemic, as many of us have heard, families needing much more support. We heard a report of many isolated, families feeling isolated. We're hearing this across systems. Family increased mental health needs. While we saw decreases in engagement in some systems, we're hearing of increases in engagement, for example, the mental health system. Need for increased access to services. Certainly during the pandemic, we saw family, food, and housing needs amplified and increased, as well as needing for increased access for culturally, linguistically diverse families, as well as in Greater Minnesota. Next slide, please. So as with any challenge, we also had learning and growth. And again, this is based on data as well as feedback from our stakeholders. And here were some of the lessons learned or some of the positives that came out of it. Next slide. Certainly, we all saw improvement in telehealth infrastructure and capacity. Every system reported that in serving families. Fewer canceled virtual appointments. For example, some of us in the mental health field, people are often able to meet appointments virtually much easier if they have access. That's a caveat. In-person wait times for services that had to be in person, some of those have been shortened. Virtual training and workshops, as we're here today, for better or for worse, we were able to move a lot of professional development and workshops online, increasing access for many. I think many of us have had the experience during pandemic. I have presented and attended workshops nationally, internationally, things that would not be a possibility if it were in person. We're all here today. We've had many examples of state early childhood trainings that had wonderful attendance because we were able to offer it virtually. And then, of course, the pandemic has given us an opportunity to step back and reevaluate, to take a look at our systems, where are some of the gaps, and learn how we can pivot and do better. Next slide, please. So our second question of the project is, how can we support family resiliency after the pandemic? We're transitioning to a new stage, maybe back to typical, whatever that is, and how can we support families during this transition, as well as take the lessons learned forward and serve children and families better moving forward? Next slide. So our key takeaways in the report, and this is just a few, there are many more in the report, but as we've heard all speakers say today, the pandemic has really exposed existing vulnerabilities in our system. We've seen families that already were underserved. We've amplified this even more. We're seeing much more disparities. That we know we will have impact on early childhood systems for years to come from the declines that we're seeing during the engagement. We think of things like screenings or our lower enrollment in Part C. What are the implications moving forward? The children still have needs. That hasn't changed. Is it going to delay access to identification, delay referrals? What are the implications for workforce capacity around that? Finally, we need to prepare for a potential surge in children and families needing early intervention supports, family supports, and preschool services. Again, family needs have not gone away, but some of it will be moved a bit down the line, and we need to be ready with capacity and workforce to meet those needs. Again, next slide, please. this was just a very quick overview of the work we're doing. We're developing a larger report that has much more details and research. This is just sort of a little taste of what's to come, but I wanted to provide that overview for you. Please feel free to reach out to me at my email at the University of Minnesota. I'm happy to engage and talk more. But thank you for your time today. And I believe, Jade, I met the goal of keeping it to 5 minutes. So thank you so much.
Great. And thank you, Jennifer. Very nice to meet you and have you present. So we're now at Q&A, and we're going to go as close to 10:30 as we can. And I'm going to just tee up one of our questions, which came, and I think I'm going to direct it to Representative Pinto, which is, why was there no increase in funding for early learning scholarships? Would you want to hazard a response on that, or?
I'm happy to do so. Yeah. And Jane, can I be seen and heard? Looks like I'm thinking that I can. Yes, you can. Okay, good. Hello, everyone. And Todd, thanks for the question that came from Todd Otis, who's long been a champion in this work. And so let me think. So both the House and the Senate heard proposals for significant increases for funding for early learning scholarships. The Senate, so the House, our Early Childhood Committee received a target. So the way things work is that the leadership in each body says a certain amount of money that the different committees can spend. The Early Childhood Committee received a $50 million increase on the House side, and we allocated $40 million of that $50 million to early learning scholarships. So we had a substantial increase, certainly relative to the money that we had to spend of state dollars. On the Senate side, there was no state general fund increase that was going to be allocated and what they sent through. However, the federal dollars that Claire talked about, that are being spent on childcare, the Senate had a proposal to spend a portion of those dollars, I think 140 million, I may be wrong, but a significant amount on early learning scholarships. So the two sides kind of came into negotiations, with the Senate proposing to spend some of those federal dollars on scholarships, the House proposing to spend the federal dollars on CCAP and other childcare issues, but to spend some state dollars on scholarships. Part of the problem in this space is how fragmented it is, that these conversations were happening in the Health and Human Services Committee and separately in the Education Committee. The Department of Human Services determined that those federal dollars could not be spent on scholarships. I will say, from my perspective too, those are dollars that were going to be spent on early learning regardless, and early childhood regardless. And so they were spent on CCAP. Determination was made they couldn't be spent on scholarships. From the Education Committee, again, the House came in wanting to spend 40 million in state dollars, Senate not allocating any. And I won't get into the details of negotiations on the education side, and I wasn't part of that conference committee in any case, but what came out of that was a significant funding increase for K-12, et cetera. But the scholarships, that was not something that moved forward. What we need to have, of course, is that everybody on all sides is really pushing hard in this area. So, Todd, I'm happy to talk to you more separately, and others as well, but that at least gives you some context as to where things were. That once we weren't going to spend federal dollars on the scholarships, which I'll say I was very supportive of not doing that because we had other places to spend them. Unfortunately, there just wasn't the political will then to spend the state dollars. So that'll be important conversations for folks to have with your legislators to say, we really need to be committed to early learning in 2022 and beyond. Thanks, Jane and all.
Thank you, Representative Pinto. There's a question here on, with the new funding is positive, but it doesn't seem like many children I shouldn't say this, like many children, many new children will be served. Is there an estimate for the number of children currently lacking access, especially infants and toddlers, that will have it because of this budget? In other words, so I don't know, Stephanie, if the budget office is looking at that or if someone in the legislature is. So I'm just going to put that question out there. Stephanie, do you want to try that, or Representative Pinto?
Sorry, Jane, could you just phrase the question really quickly one more time?
Sure. So the new funding is great, but it doesn't seem like many new children will be served. So the question is there some estimate of the gap of kids that are still going to need the services and access to programs, and especially with infants and toddlers, and who might be taking note of that, even if you don't know that?
Yeah, So I don't have an estimate on the spot, but there will be new children served through the investments in the child care assistance program and the reprioritization of the wait list, and that will likely include infants and toddlers. Um, however, I haven't seen a recent estimate of the gap. It's something I've estimated before in partnership with the Population Reference Bureau when I was at the Children's Defense Fund, because you obviously have to estimate the number of families who are working and who meet the income criteria for CCAP, and obviously scholarships doesn't have the work requirement, but so I think estimating the gap is a really worthy cause, but it's not always simple either. So I don't have an updated estimate, but there will be new children served. And I also want to mention, while there was no legislative investment in early learning scholarships, the governor did prioritize $6.4 million of the GEAR funding that passed in the December stimulus, I believe, for early learning scholarships. And I understand that that was estimated to fund about 800 new children on the early learning scholarship program.
Jane, I'll note in response to that question too, that there was increased funding for home visiting, the Laura LaCroix DeLune mentioned. And so there's an increased number of families there. I don't know if Laura has that number, but there will be some more families able to be served there. As Stephanie referenced, the reprioritization of the wait list for CCAP, and then also an investment of $15 million a year in the basic sliding fee wait list will get a number of children to be receiving additional funding and support there. But to a certain extent, and there's some other areas where one could imagine that there are increases. But in general, we've got a system that's been so deeply underfunded that the workforce and families are receiving more support, et cetera, but there continues to be a really massive gap even after this increase in funding, which again kind of sets us up for 2022 and beyond, and the need to keep at it.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And thank you both. I just mentioning Laura and Stephanie's comment, I just want to draw the attention to people that you can turn your attention to the chat, that there's information on newborn screening from Laura. There's a link to the video from Stephanie, and I noticed that Deb Fitzpatrick, I believe, has just put something up for a link to her contact information for some of the direct PowerPoint slides. We will also be posting the video from today on our YouTube channel within the next couple of days. So I just, again, want to note that. Then we have a question about family, friend, and neighbor care. And I'm going to put it out here that the question of who oversees access to workforce training and curricula for the family, friend, and neighbor care under this new funding is, where will that be administered, and who will oversee that for people concerned in that arena?
I can answer that. Right now, the funding is going to the Department of Human Services, and it will be the Child Care Division. Deb Swenson-Klatt is with us, and it will be the division in which she is part of. So both the federal funds that are dedicated to this, as well as the legislative funds. So some of the federal CCDBG resources were used or directed to a family, friend, and neighbor care earlier this year, and the legislature has added some additional resources. And it is 1.5 million. I thank you, Rep. Pinto, for correcting that.
Very good. We have a question, probably Stephanie. Are child welfare, child protection, and foster care leaders part of cross-sector discussions going on now within PDG, within some of these other systems change efforts going on at the state?
Yes, I would say in certain discussions with the PDG, child safety and permanency at DHS, as well as others who, external partners are involved in those discussions, in particular in the infant and maternal health conversations. And then, of course, the Children's Cabinet considers and works closely with child safety and permanency and other state leaders that are thinking about children involved in the child protection system. And then the PDG staff who leads the hub work through those 12 grantees, they're actually based in child safety and permanency at DHS. So those are just some examples.
That's very helpful. As we know, this is ongoing work, and just important to call this out and know a little bit more. We have just a couple of minutes left. Jennifer, there's a question about early literacy training on prenatal to 3 parents, especially parents who might be struggling with literacy. And I think what it will do is direct that question to you offline, since I'm get another question. Is that okay?
Sure. I will type it in the chat.
Okay, good.
Hey, Jane, as long as literacy was mentioned, I just wanted to note 2 other items that came out of the budget that were not mentioned earlier, which is there's a parent-child home visiting program that works on early literacy that received funding through the administration allocating federal dollars as opposed to the legislature doing so. And then Reach Out and Read. I hope folks are familiar with that, which is a wonderful program with pediatricians, and that received funding as well, again, through the administration, the Walls and Flanagan administration, allocating federal funding to those. So I just want to make sure to mention those as additional highlights coming out of this.
Thank you. I'm going to answer one of the questions myself, which has to do with family, friend, and neighbor. It does include immigrants, and this question is regarding West Africans. I think we can say that you'll want to pursue this later. We'll get back in touch. And then, what % of new early childhood funding is state money? Representative Pinto or Stephanie?
I think if you say, early childhood funding is a pretty vague category, but I would bet that the answer is that the significant portion remains federal. If you think about the spending on low-income families with young children, certainly coming out of this budget, you'll have noted that that the great majority of the increase in funding spending came from federal dollars versus state. But Stephanie may have some other comments or observations about that.
I can't answer like a percentage, but there were a lot of some of the infant and maternal health investments that Laura LaCroix DeLune talked about are state funding. Some are federally funded. Nearly all of what Claire talked about, if not all, are federally funded. There were some other state investments in early childhood, such as the extension of the voluntary pre-K seats, but those are more concerning of children older than 3. So I know that wasn't included in the presentation, but those are just to name a few. I think there were some state investments, but a lot of the federal resources were used to implement particularly the childcare access and provider support items that we talked about.
Very good. Well, this will be grist for the mill when we reconvene October 20th in person at the University of St. Thomas. And I see we are really getting down to the wire. I don't think we have any more additional questions. I want to again just thank everyone for attending today. And on behalf of University of St. Thomas, our legislators, and my colleagues and friends and elders, I just name them: Glennis, Sandy, Glenn, Mary Kay, Jim, and Katie, our team. We are just grateful for this opportunity to have this space with you, and just thank you all for the great work that's going on. And we will stay in touch, and please watch for the YouTube announcement when you'll see a chance to revisit this webinar and absorb some more information. But thank you again, and have a good remainder of the day and the summer.